Rich neighbors mocked the poor widow. They froze when a general saluted her. Margaretchen had lived in the same modest ranch house on Maple Grove Lane for 43 years. The paint had faded from white to a tired cream. The shutters hung slightly crooked, and her lawn, well, it wasn't exactly what you'd call manicured, but it was hers, paid off decades ago, and it held every memory of the life she'd built with her husband Daniel. The neighborhood had changed dramatically over those 4 decades. What used to be a street full of middle-class families, teachers, nurses, and small business owners had transformed into something Margaret barely recognized. One by one, the old houses had been bought up, torn down, and replaced with massive modern mansions that seemed to sprout like mushrooms after rain. These weren't homes. They were statements, all glass and steel and pretension, with 3-car garages and designer landscaping that required teams of workers to maintain. Margaret didn't mind a change. Not really. She believed people had the right to spend their money however they wanted. What bothered her was how some of these new neighbors treated her, like she was some kind of blight on their perfect street. A reminder of what the neighborhood used to be before it became exclusive. The Hendersons had moved in 2 years ago, right next door. Brad Henderson was something in finance, always wearing expensive suits and talking loudly on his phone about deals and markets. His wife, Sylvia, was the president of the neighborhood association, a position she took very seriously. Too seriously, in Margaret's opinion. Sylvia had short blonde hair that never moved, even in the wind, and she wore designer athleisure everywhere like she was perpetually on her way to or from a yoga class she probably never actually attended. "Margaret, we really need to talk about your property," Sylvia had said just last week, standing at Margaret's front door with her clipboard and her practiced smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The association has standards, you understand. Your house is really bringing down property values for everyone else." Margaret had smiled politely, the way she'd learned to do over the years. "My house is just fine, Sylvia. It keeps the rain out and the heat in. That's all I need. But the paint is peeling, Margaret. And your lawn, honestly, it looks like you've just given up. We have rules about maintenance. I could have the association cite you." "This house was here 30 years before your association existed," Margaret had replied, her voice still gentle but with a hint of steel underneath. "And I maintain it just fine. Maybe not to your standards, but to mine." Sylvia's smile had tightened. "Well, we'll see what the board has to say about that. The Patels across the street were newer, just moved in 6 months ago. Raj Patel had made his money in tech, sold his startup for millions, and apparently decided that gave him the right to look down on everyone who hadn't done the same. His wife, Monica, was constantly posting on social media about their blessed life and their amazing home, complete with photos of their infinity pool and wine cellar. Then there were the Johnsons, the Kramers, the Goldsteins, all variations on the same theme. Money, lots of it, and not much else to define them. They'd formed a tight little club, these wealthy neighbors, gathering for their wine tastings and charity galas, always making sure everyone knew how successful they were, how important, how much better. And they'd made Margaret their project, their problem, their favorite topic of conversation at their little gatherings. "I don't understand why she doesn't just sell," Margaret had overheard Monica Patel saying at one of their outdoor parties, her voice carrying across the yards. "That property is worth millions now. She could retire to Florida or something, somewhere more appropriate for someone in her situation. Someone needs to talk to her," Brad Henderson had added, his voice full of bourbon and confidence. "It's not fair to the rest of us. We've invested in this neighborhood. Her house looks like something out of a Depression-era documentary." Margaret had heard it all before. She'd heard worse. But it still stung, every single time. Not because she was ashamed of her house or her life, but because of what it said about these people, about how they saw the world, about how they measured worth. If only they knew. Margaret's house might have looked shabby from the outside, but inside, it was filled with treasures that had nothing to do with money. Photographs lined every wall and filled every shelf. Daniel in his dress uniform. So young and handsome, it made her heart ache even now, 20 years after his death. Their daughter Amy at her college graduation, then her wedding, then holding her own children, grandchildren at various ages. Growing up in these frozen moments of time, There were medals, too, in a simple wooden case on the mantel. Daniel's medals, earned through years of service, through sacrifice these neighbors couldn't begin to understand. The Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, the Distinguished Service Medal, and others. Margaret dusted that case every single day, running her fingers over glass, remembering. Daniel had been career Army, 30 years of service before he retired as a colonel. He'd served in Vietnam, in the Gulf War, in peacekeeping missions around the world. He'd been a leader of men, a strategist, a soldier's soldier. And he'd been the kindest man Margaret had ever known. The kind of person who saw everyone's worth regardless of their bank account or the size of their house. Maggie, he used to say, using a nickname only was allowed to use. Money comes and goes. Character stays. Remember that. She'd remembered. Even when times got tough after his death, when the medical bills from his final illness had eaten through their savings, when she'd had to make hard choices about what to spend and what to skip, she'd remembered. She'd kept the house, their house, the place where they'd raised their daughter and built their life. She'd lived simply, carefully, making every dollar stretch, because this house was more than just wood and nails. It was their story, their love, their legacy. The neighbors didn't know any of that. They didn't know that the reason her lawn wasn't perfect was because at 72, pushing a mower in the Texas heat took everything she had. They didn't know that the peeling paint wasn't neglect, but a choice between painting and buying her medications. They didn't know that the old car in her driveway still ran perfectly fine and got her where she needed to go, and that was enough. They didn't ask. They just judged. Did you see what she was wearing at the mailbox yesterday? Sylvia had said loudly enough for Margaret to hear from her porch. Those sweatpants must be from the 80s. Honestly, it's like she's not even trying. Margaret looked down at her comfortable old sweatpants, the ones Daniel had bought her for Christmas 30 years ago, worn soft with washing. They were still good. Why should she throw away something that still worked just because they weren't fashionable? It seemed wasteful, disrespectful even. But trying to explain that to Sylvia would be like trying to explain color to someone who'd only ever seen in black and white. The harassment had escalated recently. Last month, Margaret had received a formal letter from the Homeowners Association, full of legal language about property maintenance requirements and potential fines. Sylvia had hand-delivered it with a sympathetic expression that was about as genuine as a $3 bill. I hate to do this, Margaret, but rules are rules. You have 60 days to bring your property up to code or face daily fines of $500. Maybe it's time to think about selling? I know a great realtor who specializes in, well, properties like yours. Margaret had taken the letter without a word, closed her door, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to be angry, to be hurt, to feel the unfairness of it all. Then she'd made herself a cup of tea, sat in Daniel's old chair, and thought about what he would do. He'd stand his ground. That's what Daniel would do. He'd fought for his country, for freedom, for what was right. She could fight for her home. So she'd written a careful, polite response to the association, citing property law and the fact that her home violated no actual building codes or safety regulations, only the association's arbitrary aesthetic standards that had been implemented long after her house existed. She consulted with a lawyer, a young woman from Legal Aid who'd been happy to help, and learned that the association's power over her pre-existing property was limited. But the social pressure, that was something else entirely. That was what really hurt. The whispers when she got her mail. The way conversations stopped when she walked by. The obvious exclusion from neighborhood events. Brad Henderson's teenage son had even thrown eggs at her house on Halloween. Though, of course, Brad had denied it, claimed his son was at a party elsewhere, suggested maybe Margaret was confused at her age. Margaret wasn't confused. She cleaned egg off her door and windows and said nothing, because what was the point? These people had already decided who she was. Someone beneath them. Someone who didn't belong in their precious neighborhood. If only they knew who she really was. What her husband had done. What she had sacrificed. But Margaret wasn't the type to brag or explain herself. She'd never needed validation from strangers, and she wasn't about to start now. Let them think what they wanted. She knew her worth. Daniel had known her worth. That was enough. Or at least, That's what she told herself on the hard days. Today was shaping up to be one of those hard days. Margaret stood at her kitchen window, watching the activity across the street. The Patels were having some kind of party, probably another one of their exclusive gatherings for the neighborhood elite. Cars were already arriving, expensive sedans and SUVs lining the street. People in designer casual were heading toward the house with wine bottles and practiced smiles. Margaret turned away from the window and checked her own plans for the day. She had a doctor's appointment this afternoon, just a routine checkup, and then she needed to stop by the grocery store. Simple things, quiet things, the kind of days she'd grown used to. She made herself a simple lunch, tuna fish on wheat bread, an apple, a glass of water. As she ate, her eyes drifted to the photographs on the wall, landing on one of her favorites, Daniel in his uniform, standing tall and proud, his hand on her shoulder, both of them smiling at something outside the frame. Amy, maybe 5 years old, had probably been making faces at them. That had been a good day. Most days with Daniel had been good days. "I miss you," she said softly to the photograph, "especially on days like this. You always knew what to say, how to make me see the bigger picture." The photograph, of course, didn't answer, but Margaret could almost hear his voice anyway, that warm rumble that had always made her feel safe. "Hold your head high, Maggie. You've got nothing to prove to anyone." She smiled, finished her lunch, and went to get ready for her appointment. As she backed her old sedan out of the driveway, she noticed several of the party guests watching her, one of them saying something that made the others laugh. Margaret kept her eyes forward and kept driving. Let them laugh. She had more important things to worry about than the opinions of people who measured worth in square footage and designer labels. But as she drove toward town, Margaret couldn't quite shake the feeling of loneliness that had been building lately. It wasn't that she needed these neighbors to like her, but it would have been nice to have someone to talk to, someone who remembered what the neighborhood used to be like, when people knew each other's names and brought casseroles when someone was sick and didn't judge each other based on the newness of their cars. Those days seemed long gone now, replaced by something colder, shinier, and infinitely more lonely. If only these neighbors knew what was coming. If only they knew that their small, petty world was about to be shaken up in a way they'd never forget. But Margaret didn't know that yet either. She just knew she had to get through another day, holding on to her dignity and her memories, and hoping that would be enough. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to keep receiving amazing stories like this one. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an incredible tale. The doctor's appointment had gone well. Margaret was healthy for her age. Her blood pressure was good, and Dr. Kimura had been pleased with her recent test results. On the drive home, Margaret had even treated herself to a small bouquet of flowers from a grocery store, bright yellow daisies that reminded her of the ones Daniel used to bring her. But her good mood evaporated the moment she turned onto Maple Grove Lane. There were cars everywhere more than before. The Patels' party had apparently grown, spilling out onto their perfectly manicured lawn. Margaret could see clusters of well-dressed people holding wine glasses, laughing and talking, the whole scene looking like something out of a lifestyle magazine. As Margaret pulled into her driveway, she noticed several people pointing at her house, not even trying to be subtle about it. She could see Sylvia Henderson holding court with a group of women, her voice carrying across the distance. "That's the one I was telling you about," Sylvia was saying, loud enough that Margaret knew she was meant to hear. "Can you believe it? Right in the middle of our beautiful neighborhood. We've tried everything, but she just refuses to cooperate. Some people just don't understand community standards." Margaret felt her face flush, but she kept her composure. She gathered her purse and her flowers, locked her car, and walked toward her front door with her head high, just as Daniel would have wanted. "Ma'am, excuse me, ma'am." A man's voice called out, slurred slightly with alcohol. Margaret turned to see Brad Henderson weaving across his lawn toward her, a rocks glass in his hand. "We're having a neighborhood meeting over here. Don't you think you should attend? After all, we're discussing your property." Margaret stopped, her hand on her door handle. "If the association wants to speak with me, they can send me formal notice. I'm not interested in being the entertainment at your party, Mr. Henderson." Entertainment. Brad laughed, a harsh sound. "Lady, you're the problem we're trying to solve. Your house is an eyesore. We're trying to figure out how to get you to sell before you completely tank our property values." More people had stopped talking now, turning to watch the confrontation. Margaret could see phones coming out, people starting to record. Of course they were. Everything was content now. Everything was a story to share. "My property is my business," Margaret said quietly but firmly. "And I'm not selling. This is my home." "Your home?" Monica Patel had joined her husband at the edge of their lawn, her wine glass catching the afternoon sun. "Honey, that's barely a home. That's a shack. You're like a homeless person who somehow got a mortgage. No offense, but why do you go live somewhere more suitable for someone in your financial situation? There are nice senior communities, assisted living places, places for people who can't take care of themselves properly." The words stung like slaps. Margaret felt her hands trembling, but she kept them steady. She would not give these people the satisfaction of seeing her upset. "I take care of myself just fine," Margaret replied, "and I have as much right to be here as anyone else. More, actually, since I've been here longer than all of you combined." "Rights." Raj Patel had stepped forward now, his tech millionaire confidence radiating off him. "Let me explain something about rights and responsibilities. We've invested millions into this neighborhood. Millions. Our homes represent significant financial assets. Your refusal to maintain basic standards affects all of us. That's not just inconsiderate. It's practically theft." "Theft," Margaret repeated, incredulous. "I'm not taking anything from you. You're taking our property values." Brad Henderson interjected, moving closer. Margaret could smell the bourbon on his breath. "Every day your house looks like that, you're stealing from us, from our children's futures, from our investments." A crowd had gathered now, maybe 30 people, all watching this elderly woman being confronted by the neighborhood's power players. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody spoke up for Margaret. Nobody stepped forward to say this was wrong. "Look at her clothes," someone whispered, not quietly enough. "Are those from Goodwill?" "I heard she doesn't even have internet." Another voice added, "Who doesn't have internet? Is she living in the Stone Age?" "My grandmother lives better than that, and she's in a nursing home," came another comment, followed by laughter. Margaret felt surrounded, trapped in her own driveway by these people who saw her as less than human, as an obstacle to their perfect Instagram-worthy lives. Her chest felt tight, her breathing shallow. She needed to get inside, away from their stares and their judgment. "If you'll excuse me," she said, turning back to her door. "We're not done talking to you," Sylvia called out. "The association is meeting next week to discuss legal action. We're going to force you to comply or fine you into compliance. It's time you understood that you don't belong here anymore." Those words, "You don't belong here anymore," echoed in Margaret's head as she fumbled with her keys. Her hands were shaking now, making it hard to get the key in the lock. She could hear laughter behind her, someone making a joke about her age, her trembling hands, her inability to do something as simple as unlock her own door. Finally, the key slid home. Margaret pushed inside and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as tears finally came. She let herself cry for a few minutes, great heaving sobs that shook her whole body. It wasn't fair. It wasn't right. These people knew nothing about her, about what she'd sacrificed, about what Daniel had given to the country that allowed them to make their millions and live their comfortable lives. When the tears subsided, Margaret walked to the kitchen and put her daisies in water, trying to focus on their bright cheerfulness. She made herself tea, Earl Grey, the way Daniel had always made it, strong with just a touch of honey. She carried it to his chair, the worn recliner by the window, and sat down with the warmth of the cup between her hands. "They're horrible, Daniel," she said aloud to the empty room. "They're cruel and small, and they see everything through money. How did people get this way?" In her mind, she could almost hear his response. "People have always been this way. Maggie, the good and the bad, all mixed together. But you can't let the bad ones change who you are. You're better than that." "I don't know if I can do this much longer," Margaret admitted. "I'm tired. I'm so tired of fighting to just exist in my own home. She sipped her tea and looked around the room. Every corner held a memory. The spot where Amy took her first steps. The mark on the doorframe where they'd measured her height every year. The window where she and Daniel had watched thunderstorms together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them marveling at nature's power. This house was more than walls and a roof. It was her life, her history, her connection to everything that mattered. But sometimes in moments like this, Margaret wondered if it was worth it. Maybe they were right. Maybe she should just sell, take the money, move to some sterile apartment complex where she'd be surrounded by other old people waiting to die. No, Daniel wouldn't want that. Daniel had always stood his ground, always fought for what was right, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Margaret finished her tea and stood up, her resolve strengthening. She walked to the mantel and opened the wooden case that held Daniel's medals. She ran her fingers over each one, remembering the stories behind them, the sacrifices, the courage. "I won't let them win," she said softly. "I won't let them make me feel small or ashamed. This is my home, and I'm staying." She closed the case and turned to look out the window. The party was still going strong across the street, people laughing and drinking, and probably still talking about the poor widow and her shabby house. Let them talk. Words couldn't hurt her if she didn't let them. But as evening fell and the party continued, Margaret couldn't shake a feeling that something was building. She didn't know what, but there was a tension in the air, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Change was coming. She could feel it. The next morning, Margaret woke to find garbage strewn across her lawn. Someone had dumped trash on her property during the night, probably drunk partygoers from the Patel's gathering. There were beer cans, plastic cups, food containers, all scattered across her grass like confetti. Margaret stood on her porch in her bathrobe, looking at the mess, and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just about property values or neighborhood standards anymore. This was personal. This was harassment. This was cruelty for its own sake. She got dressed, went out with a trash bag, and began cleaning up the mess. It took over an hour in the morning heat, her back aching by the time she finished. As she worked, several neighbors drove by, slowing down to look, but nobody stopped to help. Nobody even waved. When she finally carried the full garbage bag to her bin, Margaret noticed Sylvia Henderson standing on her porch, coffee cup in hand, watching with an expression that might have been satisfaction. Their eyes met across the yards. Neither woman spoke. But the message was clear. This was war, and the wealthy neighbors had no intention of playing fair. Margaret went inside, locked her door, and did something she rarely did anymore. She cried, not the brief tears from yesterday, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place of profound loneliness and hurt. She cried for Daniel, for the life they'd had, for the neighborhood that used to feel like family. She cried for herself, for the indignity of being treated like trash by people who had no idea what real hardship looked like. When she was done crying, Margaret washed her face, looked at herself in the mirror, and saw Daniel looking back at her. Not literally, but she could see his influence in the set of her jaw, the steel in her eyes. She was a colonel's wife. She'd survived deployments and moves and uncertainty. She'd raised a daughter while Daniel was overseas. She'd nursed him through his final illness with grace and strength. Some rich assholes with more money than sense weren't going to break her. Margaret made herself a plan. She would document everything, every incident, every bit of harassment. She would build a case. If they wanted a legal fight, she'd give them one. She might not have their money, but she had something they didn't. She was right, and she had nothing to lose. Over the next few days, Margaret kept meticulous records. She photographed every new instance of trash on her lawn. She saved every nasty note left on her door. She recorded the times and dates when people shouted insults as they drove by. She documented everything with a thoroughness that came from being married to a military man who believed in proper documentation. She also reached out to Amy, her daughter, who lived 3 states away with her husband and children. Margaret didn't want to worry her, but she needed someone to know what was happening, just in case. "Mom, this is harassment," Amy had said on the phone, her voice tight with anger. "You need to file a police report. Better yet, come stay with us for a while. Let me handle this." No, sweetheart, Margaret had replied. This is my home. I'm not running away. You sound like Dad, Amy said, and Margaret could hear the mix of pride and worry in her voice. I'll take that as a compliment. Mom, just promise me you'll be careful. These people sound awful. I promise. And Amy, don't worry. Something tells me this is all going to work itself out. Margaret didn't know why she said that last part. She had no reason to believe things would improve. If anything, they seemed to be getting worse. But some instinct, some intuition, told her that change was coming, that justice was waiting just around the corner. She just had no idea how right she was. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel. We share incredible stories like this one every week. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, plain and official looking. Margaret almost mistook it for another threat from a homeowners association, but when she opened it, she found something entirely different. It was an invitation to a military ceremony at the local base, Fort Hamilton, about an hour's drive away. The letter was formal but warm, explaining that they were honoring families of distinguished veterans, and as the widow of Colonel Daniel Chun, Margaret's presence was specifically requested. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, reading the letter 3 times. She hadn't been to the base in years, not since Daniel's funeral. The thought of going back filled her with mixed emotions, memories both beautiful and painful. But the invitation said there would be a special tribute to Daniel and his service, something about a newly dedicated memorial building. Of course she would go. Wild horses couldn't keep her away. The ceremony was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. Margaret marked it on her calendar and felt a small spark of something she hadn't felt in months. Anticipation. Whatever was happening at the base, it would be a reminder of Daniel, of who he'd been, of the life they'd shared. That was worth any emotional difficulty. She decided not to mention it to any of the neighbors. Why would she? They weren't interested in her life, only in judging her circumstances. They probably wouldn't believe her anyway, would probably think she was making it up or exaggerating her late husband's service. But that weekend, Margaret did something she hadn't done in months. She went shopping for a new dress, not at a thrift store or a discount outlet, but at a proper department store in downtown Dallas. She used money from a small savings account she kept untouched, emergency funds she'd been hoarding for years. The saleswoman, a kind younger woman named Teresa, had been wonderful, helping Margaret find an elegant navy blue dress with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. It was respectful and dignified, exactly what Daniel would have called officer's wife appropriate. Margaret also bought new shoes, simple black pumps, and even splurged on having her hair done at a salon. When Margaret looked at herself in the mirror on Tuesday morning, dressed and ready to go, she almost didn't recognize herself. She looked like she used to look, polished and proper, the woman who'd stood beside Daniel at dozens of military functions, the woman who'd represented him when he was deployed, the woman who'd been a pillar of the military community for decades. Still got it, Maggie, she said to her reflection, and allowed herself a small smile. She left her house at noon, giving herself plenty of time to drive to the base and get through security. As she backed out of her driveway, she noticed Sylvia Henderson getting her mail. Sylvia did a visible double-take, staring at Margaret's appearance with undisguised shock. Margaret gave her a small wave, pleasant and utterly unbothered, and drove away. In her rear-view mirror, she could see Sylvia standing in her yard, staring after her, probably wondering what on earth had gotten into the poor widow. The drive to Fort Hamilton took Margaret through familiar territory. She'd made this trip countless times over the years, for Daniel's deployments and returns, for military ceremonies, for everyday errands when they'd lived in base housing early in his career. Every mile brought back memories, some joyful, some bittersweet. Security at the gate was tight, as always, but they had her name on the list. The young soldier checking IDs looked at her information, and his demeanor immediately shifted to respectful attention. "Mrs. Chun, it's an honor to have you here, ma'am. Colonel Chun was a legend. My commanding officer served under him in the Gulf War. Said he was the best leader he ever had." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you. That's very kind of you to say." I'll have someone escort you to the ceremony location. Just pull over there and wait one moment, ma'am. Within minutes, a staff car arrived with a young lieutenant who introduced herself as Jennifer Torres. She was crisp and professional in her dress uniform, and she treated Margaret with a respect that felt like cool water after months of her neighbor's disdain. Mrs. Chun, we're so honored to have you here today, Lieutenant Torres said as she drove Margaret to the ceremony location. Did they explain in the letter what we're doing today? Not in detail, Margaret admitted. Just that there was a ceremony and a memorial dedication. Lieutenant Torres smiled. It's much more than that, ma'am. We're dedicating the new officer training facility, and it's being named the Chin Leadership Center in honor of your husband. General McKinley wanted to make sure you were here for the unveiling. He served with Colonel Chun in Vietnam. Margaret's breath caught. A building named after Daniel? She'd had no idea. The letter had mentioned a memorial, but she'd assumed it was a plaque or maybe a bench. An entire building? I don't know what to say, Margaret whispered. Colonel Chun touched a lot of lives, ma'am. The officers who trained under him, the men who served with him, they're spread throughout the military now. Some of them are generals themselves. They wanted to honor his legacy in a meaningful way. They pulled up to a large, newly constructed building, modern, but with classical military architectural elements. A stage had been set up outside, with rows of chairs facing it. The area was already filling with people, military personnel, in their dress uniforms, veterans, families, and civilians. Lieutenant Torres parked and came around to open Margaret's door, offering her arm for support. Let me take you to the VIP seating, ma'am. General McKinley specifically wants to meet you before the ceremony begins. As they walked toward the stage, Margaret noticed people noticing her. Veterans standing a little straighter, some saluting even though she was a civilian. Younger soldiers watching with interest, a photographer taking pictures. This was bigger than she'd imagined, more formal, more significant. General McKinley was exactly what you'd picture when you thought of a 3-star general. Tall, imposing, with steel-gray hair and a chest full of medals. But when he saw Margaret approaching, his stern face broke into a warm smile. Margaret Chun, he said, taking both her hands in his. I'd know you anywhere. You look just like your pictures. Daniel carried a photo of you everywhere, showed it to anyone who'd look. General McKinley, Margaret replied, smiling through sudden tears. Daniel spoke of you so often. He said you saved his life in Da Nang. He saved mine first in Hue City, the general replied. That's how it worked with Daniel. He took care of his people. Always. He gestured to the building behind them. This is long overdue. Colonel Chin shaped more officers, influenced more military thinking than most generals do. He did it quietly, without fanfare, but every one of us who knew him, who served with him, we knew. We knew we were in the presence of something special. Margaret couldn't speak, could only nod as emotions overwhelmed her. All those years of Daniel coming home exhausted but fulfilled, telling her stories about his soldiers, his trainees, his fellow officers. All those times he'd stayed up late writing evaluations and recommendations, mentoring young lieutenants, teaching and shaping the next generation of military leaders. She'd known it mattered to him, but she hadn't fully understood the scope of his influence. He would be so honored, Margaret finally managed to say, and so humbled. Daniel never thought of himself as special. That's what made him special, General McKinley said. Now, let me introduce you to some people who want to meet you. For the next 30 minutes, Margaret was introduced to a stream of officers, from lieutenants to colonels, each with their own story about Daniel, how he'd mentored them, advised them, changed their approach to leadership. Many of them had brought their families, wanting their children to understand the importance of honoring those who served. One colonel, a woman about 50, took both of Margaret's hands and said, "Your husband saved my career. I was ready to resign my commission after a terrible deployment. Colonel Chin spent 6 hours with me, helping me process what I'd experienced, showing me how to lead through trauma. I'm a base commander now because of him. My own daughter is at West Point because she saw how much I love serving because of what he taught me." These stories, one after another, painted a picture of Daniel that Margaret had known but never quite seen so clearly. He'd been her husband, her partner, her best friend. But to these people, he'd been a legend, a teacher, a father figure, a leader who'd shaped the military itself through the officers he'd trained. The ceremony began at exactly 2 p.m. Military precision as always. The national anthem played, colors were presented, and General McKinley took the stage. His speech was eloquent and powerful, talking about leadership, sacrifice, and the qualities that make not just good soldiers, but good human beings. Colonel Danielson embodied everything we aspire to be, the general said, his voice carrying across a crowd of several hundred people. He was brave but not reckless, strong but compassionate, demanding but fair. He led from the front, but never forgot the soldiers behind him. And he did all of this while being a devoted husband, father, and friend. The general gestured to Margaret. "Mrs. Chun, would you please stand?" Margaret rose, her legs shaking slightly as applause erupted. She saw people wiping tears, saw a young soldier standing at attention, saw veterans saluting her. The respect, the honor, the recognition, it was overwhelming. Margaret Chin supported Daniel through 30 years of military service. The general continued. She raised their daughter largely alone during his deployments. She moved across the country, across the world, 17 times, never complaining, always adapting. She hosted countless young officers in her home, providing them advice, comfort, and home-cooked meals when they needed it most. She is, in every way, a military spouse hero, and we honor her today as well. More applause, louder now. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, but she didn't wipe them away. These were good tears, healing tears, tears that washed away months of hurt and humiliation. The ceremony continued with more speeches, a military band playing, and finally, the unveiling of the building's dedication plaque. It read, "The Chun Leadership Center dedicated in honor of Colonel Daniel Chun, United States Army. Leadership is not about being in charge. It's about taking care of those in your charge. His legacy lives on through those he served." Margaret touched the plaque with trembling fingers, tracing Daniel's name, and felt his presence so strongly it was like he was standing beside her. She could almost hear his voice, feel his hand on her shoulder, sense his pride not in himself but in all the lives he'd touched. After the ceremony, there was a reception inside the building. Margaret toured the facility, saw the state-of-the-art training rooms, the library filled with military history and leadership books, the Hall of Honor, where photographs of distinguished officers lined the walls. Daniel's photo had pride of place, and Margaret stood before it for a long time, remembering the day it was taken, remembering everything. "Mrs. Chun?" A young captain approached, holding the hand of a little boy about 6 years old. "I wanted my son to meet you. I trained under Colonel Chun. He taught me that being a good soldier means being a good person first. I tell my son about him all the time." The little boy looked up at Margaret with wide eyes. "My daddy says your husband was a hero." Margaret knelt down, bringing herself to the child's level. "Your daddy is right, but do you know what made him a hero? It wasn't just bravery in battle. It was kindness every single day. It was helping people. It was doing the right thing even when it was hard. I want to be like that," the boy said solemnly. "Then you will be a hero too," Margaret replied, touching his cheek gently. As the reception wound down, General McKinley approached Margaret again. "We have something else for you," he said, gesturing to an aide who brought forward a wooden case. The general opened it to reveal a medal, the Legion of Merit, one of the highest peacetime awards. This was approved years ago, but never formally presented to Daniel due to his illness. "We'd like to present it to you now, in his honor and in recognition of your own service as a military spouse." Margaret accepted the medal with shaking hands, adding it to the collection at home. Another piece of Daniel's legacy, another reminder of what he'd meant to so many people. As she was preparing to leave, Lieutenant Torres approached with a knowing smile. "Mrs. Chun, General McKinley has arranged for something special. He'd like to escort you home personally. He wants to see where Colonel Chin lived, pay his respects at his home." "That's not necessary," Margaret started to say, but the general was already there, his car pulling up. "It would be my honor, Margaret," he said. "Besides, I insist." A 3-star general escorting a hero's widow home is the least this army can do. Margaret was too overwhelmed to argue. She climbed into the general's car, accompanied by Lieutenant Torres and another aide, and they began to drive back to Maple Grove Lane. As they drove, the general shared more stories about Daniel, making Margaret laugh with tales of her husband's dry humor and occasional pranks. He was always so serious at home, Margaret said, wiping tears of laughter. I had no idea he had such a mischievous side. Oh, Daniel knew how to have fun, the general assured her, but he also knew when to be serious. That's what made him such an effective leader. As they got closer to her neighborhood, Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. What would her neighbors think, seeing her arrive in a military convoy? Then she thought, why should she care? Let them see. Let them understand, finally, who she really was, who Daniel had been. Are you loving this story? Subscribe to our channel right now. We bring you amazing, inspiring stories every week. Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the incredible conclusion. The general's car, followed by 2 military escort vehicles, turned onto Maple Grove Lane at exactly 5:30 p.m., prime time for the neighborhood. People were arriving home from work, getting mail, walking dogs, doing yard work. It was a time when the street was most alive, most populated, and everyone stopped to stare as the military convoy drove slowly down the street. Margaret could see faces at windows, people stepping out of their houses, neighbors pausing in their driveways. The vehicles weren't subtle, official military plates, flags flying, unmistakably important. The kind of motorcade that only accompanied very high-ranking officers. Sylvia Henderson was getting into her BMW, probably heading to the gym or another association meeting. She froze, her hand on the car door, watching the convoy approach. Brad was mowing his lawn, despite having a lawn service, probably for show. He shut off the mower and stood there, confused. The Patels were both outside, Monica filming something for her social media, Raj on his phone as always. They both looked up, Monica's phone dropping to her side. The Johnsons, the Kramers, the Goldsteins, one by one, the neighbors who'd made Margaret's life miserable, who'd mocked her, harassed her, dismissed her, they all stopped what they were doing to watch. The lead vehicle pulled into Margaret's driveway. The escort vehicles parked on the street. And then, in a moment Margaret would replay in her mind 1,000 times, General James McKinley, 3 stars gleaming on his shoulders, stepped out of the car. He straightened his uniform, adjusted his cap, and then, in a gesture that made Margaret's heart swell, he walked around the car and opened her door himself, offering his hand to help her out. Margaret stepped out of the car in her elegant new dress, her head high, her posture straight, every inch the officer's wife she'd always been. And General McKinley, a 3-star general, saluted her. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was a full, formal military salute, holding it until Margaret, who knew military protocol, nodded to acknowledge it. Only then did he drop his hand. "Thank you for allowing me to escort you home, Mrs. Chun," he said, his voice loud enough to carry. "It's the very least I could do for the widow of one of the finest officers I've ever known." The street was dead silent now. Everyone watching, everyone close enough to hear, everyone trying to understand what they were seeing. Lieutenant Torres and the aide exited the other vehicles and stood at attention. They weren't saluting. That wasn't protocol. But their bearing was unmistakably respectful, honoring not just Margaret, but the home she was entering. Margaret became aware of Brad Henderson approaching, his confusion written all over his face. Behind him, she could see Sylvia hurrying over, not wanting to miss whatever was happening. "General," Margaret said quietly, "I appreciate this more than you know, but you don't have to." "I know I don't have to," the general interrupted gently. "I want to. Your husband was a friend and a mentor. You stood beside him for 30 years. That deserves respect. That deserves recognition. And frankly, Margaret, I want to see where Daniel spent his retirement, where he was happy." Margaret smiled, understanding. The general wanted to see Daniel's home, yes, but he was also making a statement, showing this neighborhood, these people who judged her, exactly who she was. "Please come in," Margaret said, leading the way to her front door. As they walked up the path, Margaret was acutely aware of the neighbors gathering. More people were coming out of their houses now, drawn by the spectacle. She could feel their confusion, their curiosity, their dawning realization that they'd made a terrible mistake about who she was. Sylvia couldn't contain herself anymore. She rushed forward, her heels clicking on the pavement. "Excuse me, General. I'm Sylvia Henderson, president of the Neighborhood Association. I don't mean to intrude, but is there some sort of official military business? Because we weren't notified of any." General McKinley turned to look at Sylvia, and his expression was pure professional ice. It was a look that made colonels snap to attention, and lieutenants check their uniforms. Sylvia physically took a step back. "I'm visiting the widow of Colonel Daniel Chun," the general said, his voice polite but with an edge of steel. "A man who served this country with distinction for 30 years. A man who trained and mentored hundreds of officers, including myself. This is a personal visit to pay respects to his family and his home. No official business. Just respect." He let that last word hang in the air like a challenge. Just respect. The thing these neighbors had failed to show Margaret for months. "Oh," Sylvia said, her face flushing. "I didn't know. We didn't know that Margaret's husband was a decorated colonel, a Bronze Star recipient, a Purple Heart recipient, the officer who shaped modern military leadership training." The general's tone was still polite, but barely. "No, I suppose you didn't know. Because you never asked." Brad Henderson had joined his wife now, and behind them, Margaret could see more neighbors gathering. Monica and Raj Patel, the Johnsons, the Kramers, easily 20 people now, all watching, all listening. "Mrs. Chun," the general continued, turning his attention back to Margaret and essentially dismissing Sylvia and Brad. "Would you show me Daniel's study? I'd love to see where he spent his time." "Of course," Margaret said, unlocking her door and leading the way inside. As the general, Lieutenant Torres, and the aide followed her in, Margaret glanced back to see the neighbors still standing there, frozen, processing what they'd just witnessed. The door closed behind them, leaving the neighborhood to their thoughts. Inside, Margaret felt herself relax slightly. This was her space, filled with her memories and her life. The general removed his cap and looked around, taking the photographs, the medals on display, the comfortable, lived-in feel of the home. "This is perfect," he said softly. "This is exactly how I'd imagined Daniel's home would be, full of love and memory." He walked to the mantel, looking at the medal case, at the photographs. He picked up one of Daniel, in his dress uniform, and smiled. This was taken after he received the Distinguished Service Medal. "I was there that day. He gave the most humble acceptance speech I've ever heard. Spent the whole time thanking other people." "That sounds like Daniel," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. The general toured the small house, listening as Margaret pointed out different items and shared their stories. He seemed genuinely interested, asking questions, laughing at funny anecdotes, his respect for Daniel and Margaret evident in every interaction. When they reached Daniel's study, a small room with bookshelves lined with military history and leadership books, the general stood for a long moment, just taking it in. "Permission to sit in his chair, Margaret?" he asked. "Of course." The general sat in Daniel's old desk chair and ran his hand over the worn armrest. "I used to think about what I'd do when I retired," he said. "I always thought I'd want something grand, you know? A big house, lots of land. Something impressive. But seeing this, I understand what Daniel knew. Home isn't about impressing people. It's about being surrounded by what matters." He stood and turned to Margaret. "Those people out there, your neighbors, they don't understand that. They think value is measured in square footage and property assessments. Daniel knew better. You know better. They've been very cruel," Margaret admitted quietly. "For months now. They want me to sell, to leave because my house doesn't meet their standards." The general's expression darkened. "Is that so? And what do they know about standards? About sacrifice? About service?" He shook his head. "Margaret, I'm going to make sure everyone on this base knows about you and Daniel's home. And I'm going to make sure those neighbors understand exactly what kind of person they've been harassing." "You don't have to do that," Margaret protested. I know I don't have to. I want to. He smiled. Besides, I think we're going to make this a regular thing. I'd like to visit whenever I'm in the area, if you'll have me. And I know several other officers who'd love to pay their respects. Colonel Chen's home should be a place of honor, not harassment. They spent another hour talking, sharing stories, remembering Daniel. Lieutenant Torres joined in, sharing how Colonel Chen's teaching methods were still being used in officer training, how his influence continued to shape military leadership. Finally, as the sun was setting, the general prepared to leave. They walked to the front door together, and the general paused before opening it. Margaret, what happens next is up to you. I can speak to those neighbors if you'd like. I can make phone calls, apply pressure, or I can simply leave and let them draw their own conclusions from what they've seen. What would you prefer? Margaret thought about it. Part of her wanted the general to dress down her neighbors, to make them understand how badly they behaved. But another part, the part that had been married to Daniel for 43 years, knew that wasn't necessary. I think, Margaret said slowly, that they've already learned what they needed to learn. If they haven't, then nothing you say will change them. The general smiled. Wise answer. Daniel chose well. He opened the door, and they stepped back out into the evening air. The street wasn't empty. In fact, there were more people now than before, neighbors who'd gotten home from work, others who'd been called by those who'd witnessed the earlier scene. At least 30 people stood in yards and driveways, trying to look casual, but obviously waiting to see what would happen next. The general put his cap back on, straightened his uniform, and in a voice that carried across the neighborhood, said, Mrs. Chun, thank you for your hospitality. Hosting you today at the dedication of the Chin Leadership Center was an honor. Having you show me Daniel's home, where he found peace after his years of service, was a privilege. I'll be back to visit soon, if you'll have me. Any time, General, Margaret replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. You're always welcome in Daniel's home. The general saluted her again, that same full, formal salute. This time, several other people in the street, veterans who'd been drawn by the military vehicles, joined him, their right hands snapping to their foreheads in perfect synchronization. Margaret stood on her porch, tears streaming down her face, and acknowledged each salute with nod. These people, some of them strangers, understood something her wealthy neighbors had failed to grasp. Honor, respect, and a debt owed to those who serve. The general and his team climbed back into their vehicles. As they prepared to leave, Brad Henderson, looking like he'd swallowed something bitter, approached the general's car. The window rolled down. General, I owe Mrs. Chin an apology, Brad said, his voice strained. We all do. We didn't know about her husband's service. The general looked at him coldly. You shouldn't have needed to know about her husband's service to treat her with basic human decency, Mr. Henderson. She's a 72-year-old widow living in her own home. That should have been enough for respect. Brad stepped back, properly chastened, as the vehicles pulled away. Margaret watched them go, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders that she'd been carrying for months. She turned to go back inside, but found Sylvia blocking her path, tears running down her perfectly made-up face. Margaret, I'm so sorry, Sylvia said, her voice breaking. I'm so sorry. We've been awful to you. I've been awful to you. I didn't know. You didn't ask, Margaret interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. You saw an old woman in an old house, and you assumed you knew everything about me. You judged me based on paint and lawn care and the age of my car. You never once thought I might have a story, a history, a life that meant something. You're right, Sylvia admitted, crying harder now. God, you're so right. Can you ever forgive me? Can you forgive us? Margaret looked past Sylvia at the gathered neighbors. She saw shame on many faces, genuine remorse on some, and on a few, just confusion about what they'd witnessed. These were the people she'd have to live among, the people who'd made her life miserable. I can forgive you, Margaret said slowly. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean everything goes back to normal. You need to understand something. All of you. She raised her voice so everyone could hear. My husband spent 30 years serving this country. He deployed to war zones. He trained officers who went on to become generals. He shaped military policy and leadership, and when he retired, all he wanted was a quiet place to live out his days in peace. She paused, looking around at all the faces. This house might not be as fancy as yours. It might not have a perfect lawn or fresh paint or the newest appliances, but it's filled with love and memories and sacrifice. It's worth more than any of your mansions because of what it represents. If you can't understand that, if you can't respect that, then we'll never be friends. We'll just be neighbors. Don't stop now. Subscribe to our channel to see how this incredible story ends. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the final part. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of activity outside. For a moment, she felt a flash of anxiety, wondering if it was another harassment incident. But when she looked out her window, she saw something entirely different. Brad Henderson was in her yard, and he was mowing her lawn. Properly mowing it, not sabotaging it, actually doing the work. Sylvia was pulling weeds from Margaret's flower beds. Her designer athleisure already dirty. And there were others. Raj Patel trimming her hedges, Monica gathering the fallen branches from her trees, the Johnsons painting her mailbox. Margaret opened her front door and stepped out onto her porch, stunned. Sylvia looked up, saw her, and stood, wiping her hands nervously. "We wanted to help," Sylvia said simply. "We know we can't undo the past few months, but we want to try to make things right. If you'll let us." Margaret didn't know what to say. Part of her was still hurt, still angry at how they'd treated her. But another part, the part that had learned grace and forgiveness from Daniel, recognized genuine remorse when she saw it. "You don't have to do this," Margaret said. "We know," Brad replied, shutting off the mower. "But we want to." "Margaret, what the general said yesterday about not needing to know your husband's service to treat you with decency, he was right. We've been terrible neighbors. We let property values and status become more important than humanity. That changes now. At least it changes for me." Over the next few hours, Margaret watched as her neighbors, people who'd mocked and harassed her, worked to improve her property. They didn't do it to erase their guilt. She could see that wasn't the motivation. They did it because they genuinely wanted to help, wanted to show through actions, not words, that they understood how wrong they'd been. By noon, Margaret's lawn looked better than it had in years. Her flower beds were weeded and mulched. Her mailbox had a fresh coat of paint. Small repairs had been made to her shutters. The house still looked old, but it looked cared for, loved, maintained. "Thank you," Margaret said when they gathered on her porch for water. "This is very kind." "It's the least we could do," Monica Patel said, her usual social media polish replaced by genuine emotion. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about your house being filled with love and memories. I've got a huge house, the latest everything, but when I think about it, I don't know if my kids will have the kind of memories you're describing. We're so busy trying to impress everyone that we forget to just live, to just be together." "It's never too late to start," Margaret said gently. "Memories aren't made in expensive places. They're made in moments, in attention, in showing up for the people you love." The group stood there for a moment, the awkwardness of the past months hanging in the air, but beginning to dissipate. These weren't her friends. Not yet, maybe not ever. But for the first time, they felt like actual neighbors, people who shared a street and maybe, just maybe, could share something more. Over the next week, word of what had happened spread to the neighborhood and beyond. Lieutenant Torres called to check on Margaret and mentioned that the story of the general's visit had made the rounds on base. Several other officers had asked for Margaret's address, wanted to send notes or visit. True to his word, General McKinley returned the following Sunday, this time bringing his wife Susan, who'd known Daniel and Margaret years ago. They brought dinner, homemade lasagna, and salad, and the three of them spent the evening sharing stories and memories. When the general and his wife left that evening, several neighbors were outside. This time, instead of judgment, Margaret saw respect. People waved, called out greetings, treated her like a member of the community rather than a problem to be solved. The Homeowners Association formally withdrew their complaints about Margaret's property. Sylvia, still president, had led a vote to amend the association bylaws to include exceptions for long-term residents and to emphasize community support over aesthetic enforcement. We're neighbors first, Sylvia had said at the meeting. Property values are important, but they're not more important than people. We lost sight of that. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from unexpected places. The Patel children, teenagers who'd never paid Margaret any attention, started stopping by after school. At first, it was just to help with small chores, taking out her trash bins or bringing in her mail. But soon, they were staying to talk, asking about her life, about Daniel, about history. "My dad talks about you differently now," Raj and Monica's daughter Priya said one afternoon as she helped Margaret plant new flowers. "He says you're what real success looks like. Not money or a big house, but a life well lived, a love that lasted, service that mattered." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "Your father said that?" "Yeah. I think meeting you, learning about Colonel Chun, it changed something in him. He's been different, kinder, less obsessed with work. He actually ate dinner with us 3 times this week. That hasn't happened in months." These small changes, multiplied across the neighborhood, created a shift in the community's culture. People were friendlier, more considerate. The focus on status and wealth, while still present, was balanced now with genuine human connection. Margaret's house became a sort of informal community center for the neighborhood kids. She'd lived through so much history, had so many stories to tell. Children would stop by to ask about the Cold War for a school project and stay for cookies and tales of military life. Teenagers working on college essays about perseverance or resilience would interview her about Daniel's service and her own experiences as a military spouse. "You're like the neighborhood grandmother," one teenage boy said, and Margaret had laughed, delighted. "I'm everyone's grandmother now," she replied, "and I love it." But the most profound change was internal. Margaret realized that the months of harassment, as painful as they'd been, had taught her something important. She'd stood her ground. She'd maintained her dignity. She'd stayed true to who she was and what mattered, even when it would have been easier to give up and move away. Daniel would have been proud. 3 months after the general's visit, Margaret received another letter from Fort Hamilton. They wanted to establish an annual scholarship in Daniel's name for the children of enlisted soldiers, and they wanted Margaret's input on the selection criteria. Margaret worked with the base's education office to create something that reflected Daniel's values. The scholarship wouldn't just go to students with the highest grades or the most impressive achievements. It would go to students who demonstrated character, resilience, kindness, and commitment to service. The first scholarship was awarded on what would have been Daniel's 75th birthday. Margaret attended the ceremony and met the recipient, a young woman whose father had served under Daniel years ago. The girl planned to study social work, wanting to help military families navigate the challenges of deployment and transition. "Colonel Chun helped my dad through some really tough times," the girl said. "This scholarship, being able to go to college because of his legacy, it's like he's still helping our family." Margaret hugged her tightly. He would be so happy to know that. Life settled into a new normal. Margaret's house still looked old, still needed work that she did when she could afford it, but it no longer felt like a source of shame or conflict. It was simply home, her home, filled with everything that mattered. The neighborhood parties now included her, people seeking her out specifically, wanting her stories and her perspective. She wasn't decoration or charity. She was valued, respected, part of the community in a way she hadn't been since Daniel died. Sylvia Henderson had become, surprisingly, something like a friend, not a close friend, but someone Margaret could talk to, someone who'd learned humility and grace through her own mistakes. "I think about that day all the time," Sylvia admitted one afternoon as they sat on Margaret's porch drinking iced tea. "The way I treated you, the way we all treated you. It makes me sick, honestly. I was so focused on property values and appearances that I forgot about basic human decency." "You learn," Margaret said simply. "That's what matters. We all make mistakes. The question is whether we learn from them or repeat them." "I'm trying to learn," Sylvia said. "I really am. I've started volunteering at the Veterans Center downtown, working with families going through transitions. It's eye-opening, seeing what military families sacrifice, what they go through. I had no idea. Most people don't, Margaret replied. Military families are good at making it look easy, but it's not. It's hard, it's lonely, it requires constant sacrifice. Daniel used to say that every military member serves, but so does their family. We just don't wear the uniform. On the first anniversary of General McKinley's visit, Margaret received an unexpected package. Inside was a beautiful photograph of the Chin Leadership Center, professionally framed, with a plaque that read, "In honor of Margaret Chin, who exemplifies the strength and grace of military spouses everywhere." There was also a letter from the general. "Dear Margaret, a year ago, I had the privilege of visiting your home and reminding your neighbors of who you are and what you represent. I've thought about that visit often. You showed more grace and dignity than I think I would have in your situation. You stood your ground without losing your kindness. That's real strength. The Chun Leadership Center is transforming how we train officers. Daniel's influence continues to shape military leadership in ways he never could have imagined. And you, by sharing with the military for 30 years, by supporting him through deployments and challenges, by carrying on his legacy with such grace, you're part of that transformation. I hope those neighbors have learned their lesson. But whether they have or not, I want you to know that the military community sees you, honors you, and will always be grateful for your sacrifice and service. With deepest respect and admiration, General James McKinley." Margaret placed a photograph on her mantle, next to Daniel's medals, a reminder that worth isn't measured in pain and landscaping, but in love, service, and the lives we touch. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Margaret sat in Daniel's chair by the window, a cup of tea in her hands, and looked out at Maple Grove Lane. Children were playing in the street, neighbors were chatting in their yards. Someone was grilling, filling the air with the smell of summer barbecue. It wasn't perfect. The houses were still too big, too ostentatious, symbols of wealth rather than homes full of memories. But the people, they were learning. They were trying. And that was enough. "We did okay, didn't we, Daniel?" Margaret said softly to the empty room. "We built a good life. We stood for something. And somehow, even after you're gone, you're still teaching people, still making a difference." A warm breeze came through the open window, rustling the curtains, and Margaret chose to believe it was Daniel's way of agreeing, of letting her know that yes, they'd done okay. Better than okay. They'd done exactly what they set out to do. Live with honor, love with everything they had, and leave the world a little better than they found it. Margaret Chin had started as the poor widow mocked by her rich neighbors. She'd ended as a respected matriarch of Maple Grove Lane, a living reminder that true worth has nothing to do with money and everything to do with character. Her house might never be the fanciest on the block, but it was, without question, the most valuable, because it was filled with love. And in the end, that's all that really matters.